We've gone over a lot of arguments for the existence of God on this channel, but one argument that I think we haven't given enough attention to yet is Aristotle's argument for God. Now, some of you may be surprised to hear that Aristotle even had an argument for God, since he was born and raised in ancient Greece, and the ancient Greeks were pagans, with a pantheon of many gods like Zeus and Apollo and Athena and Poseidon. But sure enough, Aristotle, like his teacher Plato, prided himself on being a free thinker, and actually came up with a philosophical argument for why there must be a being very similar to the God of Christianity, a being that Aristotle called the unmoved mover. So in this video, I'm going to summarize Aristotle's argument for the existence of the unmoved mover. Aristotle's argument, which comes from Book 12 of his Metaphysics, starts with an unusual premise. Aristotle begins with the idea that the universe must have always existed. The reason that this is kind of an unusual starting point for an argument for God is that there's actually a lot of arguments for God that start with the exact opposite premise. They start with the idea that the universe must have not always existed, that it must have had a beginning at some point in the past. But Aristotle is convinced that if the universe had a beginning, then at some point in the past, there would have been nothing, and the universe would have had to, as he says, proceeded out of night and out of non-being. In other words, it must have come from nothing, which is impossible, since something can't come from nothing. Interestingly, this is where those other arguments for God I mentioned would conclude that God must exist, because they say there must be something whose existence is necessary to ensure that there was something to start the universe when it began to exist at some point in the past. But Aristotle apparently never considered this as a possibility, and he concluded instead that the universe must be absolutely eternal, with no beginning in the past, because if it began to exist at some point in the past, it would have had to exist from nothing, and it therefore wouldn't exist today, which is obviously absurd, because the universe does exist. So the universe is eternal for Aristotle. But if this is true, he argues, time must be eternal too, because it wouldn't make sense to talk about the universe existing for an infinite amount of time if at some point time didn't exist. Also, to give another argument for that point, if there was some time in the past where time didn't exist, how would time ever be able to start up again on its own power, since everything in the world would have to be frozen in a single moment of time, and nothing would be able to move? And wouldn't something have to move in order to unfreeze time? It's a good argument, I think. But speaking of movement, or lack thereof, this brings us to the central idea of Aristotle's argument. One of the most important things to understand in this argument is that time, for Aristotle, is fundamentally dependent on the notion of movement. For Aristotle, time is a measure of movement. If things are moving, they are in time. But if everything ever stopped moving all at once, then that would mean that time has stopped. And if this ever happened, time and motion would never be able to get started up again on their own power, since nothing would be able to move if time has stopped, and time wouldn't be able to pick back up again if nothing can move. This leads Aristotle to the conclusion that as long as the universe has been existing, at least something in it has been moving. This is a super important idea for understanding this argument, so let me go through that again to make sure we have it down. Time, for Aristotle, is dependent on motion. If you don't have motion, you don't have time, since time is measured by things moving. So since Aristotle has already concluded that time must have existed going back infinitely, motion, too, must have existed going back infinitely, which means that there has never, ever, ever been a point in Aristotle's infinite history of the world where there wasn't something moving. With that background, let's look at the next step of the argument. Now that Aristotle has said that motion must have always existed in some form in the universe, he now has to say how that's possible. Okay, let's take option 1. Let's say that all the motion in the universe is done by objects which move contingently. These objects don't have to move, and they're not always moving. Sometimes they move, sometimes they stop moving, but at least one of these objects is always moving, so there's always motion in the universe. The problem there is, given enough time, then there's guaranteed to be a moment where every single object in this system stops moving. And if that was the case, you would run into Aristotle's paradox. Why is this? Well, let's say you have two contingently moving objects, two of the kind of objects we talked about. Well, given a long enough period of time, they're both going to stop moving at some point, because remember, these are the kind of objects that move sometimes and don't move sometimes. But given a long enough period of time, the times where these two objects aren't moving are bound to overlap, and you're going to have a moment where both of these objects are still not moving. All right, let's take 10 of these objects. Well, it's going to take a longer period of time, but eventually you're going to have a time where all of these contingently moving objects stop moving. We can even turn this into a kind of absolute rule. The more contingently moving objects you have, the more time it will take for there to be a point where they all stop moving at the same time, but given enough time, there will eventually still be that point where they all stop moving at the same time. All right, then, you ask, but what if you have an entire universe full of trillions and trillions of these kind of contingently moving things? Surely there won't ever be a point in time where they all stop moving at the same time, right? I mean, it would take a really, really long period of time to have that many things all happen to stop moving at the same time. Like, an infinite period of time. Oh, right. And that's exactly the problem. Remember, Aristotle said that the universe has existed for an infinite period of time. So given an infinite period of time, each contingently moving object in the universe will have stopped moving an infinite number of times, which means that it's guaranteed that there was at some point in the past a moment when they all stopped moving at the exact same time. And given what Aristotle has argued already, this would lead to a paradox, since if there was ever a moment in the past when all motion stopped, there could never again be motion in the universe, meaning that there shouldn't be any motion today if at some point in the past there was no motion. But given an infinite past, this moment without motion must have happened at some point. So there shouldn't be any motion today if every object in the world only moves contingently. But motion does exist today, obviously. Therefore, Aristotle concludes, there must be at least one object which moves not contingently, but necessarily. An object that doesn't just happen to move sometimes and not move at other times, but is always moving by its very nature, and could never stop moving even in theory, ensuring that we never end up in a world without motion. For Aristotle, this necessarily moving thing is ultimately, when you trace it back, the universe as a whole. For Aristotle, the universe as a whole is moving with a kind of necessity. So now let's introduce a very, very important principle for Aristotle. For Aristotle, everything that is moved must be moved by something else. Nothing, he says, can move itself. Think about it. If something could move itself, it would have to change itself, which means it in turn would have to give itself some kind of being that it didn't have already, because that's what change is. But nothing can give what it doesn't already have. And if this thing already had the being it was giving itself, it wouldn't really be changing itself by giving the being to itself because it already had it. Therefore, nothing can move itself, and whatever is moved must be moved by another. This means that there must be something outside the universe which moves the universe, and that this thing must also move the universe with necessity, because, as Aristotle said, the universe must move of necessity, according to the argument we just gave. That means that this being must be a necessarily existing, eternal being, because if it wasn't necessarily existing, it couldn't move the universe of necessity, and if it wasn't eternal, it couldn't move the universe through all time. It also must be immaterial, because it needs to be outside the universe in order to move it, and the material universe is, last time I checked, material. But if this being is immaterial, then it must also be a person, because the only kind of immaterial beings that aren't causally inert, like Plato's forms, are persons. And Aristotle needs this being to move the world, and it can't move the world if it's causally inert, if it has no power to move anything. Importantly, this being also must be unable to move, because if it was moving, there would have to be something moving it, and we wouldn't have an ultimate explanation of the movement of the universe, because we'd have to ask what was moving this thing. Hence, Aristotle's decision to call this thing the unmoved mover. It's a thing that moves everything in the universe without being moved itself. Therefore, Aristotle concludes that there must exist a being who is necessary, immaterial, eternal, personal, and existing outside the universe, yet responsible for causing all of the motion which exists in it. A being he calls the unmoved mover. Hopefully, you can see by now why I and many other Christian thinkers throughout history have identified Aristotle's unmoved mover with God. What Aristotle arrives at is the existence of a being who exists entirely outside the universe and sustains all of the activity occurring inside it, who is immaterial, eternal, personal, and importantly, unchanging. Granted, This isn't a perfect description of the Christian conception of God by any means, but it's a lot closer to the God of the Bible than it is to the changing material gods of ancient Greece. Now, you might have problems with this argument. Maybe you're not convinced by Aristotle's idea that the universe is eternal, or you have doubts about some other of his more particular ideas, or maybe you just don't think the argument follows logically. Frankly, I'm not going to say that you're wrong to think any of that. Honestly, I'm actually not sure what I think of this argument myself. Personally, I think a much stronger but very similar argument for God was given by St. Thomas Aquinas in the beginning of his Summa Theologica. This argument, like Aristotle's, uses the existence of motion as the starting point to try to prove that God exists, but unlike Aristotle's, it doesn't get bogged down in the whole discussion about the paradoxes of a finite past or how motion and time are related. As a bonus, Aquinas' argument also establishes more of the classical Christian attributes of God, like God being all-knowing or all-good. So that's a plus. So does Aristotle's argument prove that God exists? Maybe not exactly as Aristotle articulated it. But what Aristotle gave us was a really good launching point for some of the best arguments for God, like Aquinas's. I'll take that as a major accomplishment from one of history's greatest philosophers. But whatever you may think of this argument, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and God bless.